So, that was my German directness, as they say. Now I'm really, really happy to have with us Carl. Carl really crosses borders. He's half French, half Kiwi, born in England. So, he moved to New Zealand when he was really little, living in Auckland for a very long time, also including with his family now. And he just moved to Christchurch just really a couple of days ago, taking on a new role as senior producer at Cerebral Fix. I hate that name. It's an amazing games company who is doing like really great work in the games industry. They are located in the city center and is, again, one of the two major game companies that this city has. But Carl today is here in his role as chair of New Zealand Game Developers Association. It's a growing industry. It's a lively industry. They have an annual conference, which is really, really great. It's very inclusive and supportive and producing a lot of creative games that are shipped all over the world. So it's really great. And his talk is about following the flow. So welcome, Carl.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Haida, Maria, and the ISAGA community, Tim McKenzie, for just giving me the opportunity to talk to a bunch of people for a little bit. This was a really interesting challenge for me as someone who loves games from all angles. The opportunity to talk to this audience was really unique, and it really made me have to do a lot of research and thinking as to what could I talk about that is of value. And I spent a long time going back and forth, not really knowing exactly what all of you get up to on a day-to-day basis or where your mindset is at when you are making your games or your products or your research papers and that kind of thing. So I am going to try and speak to areas that I feel confident talking about, and I hope that from my perspective you can take a few things and apply it to your journey and your mindset about how you view games as a medium. So I have a bit of an agenda. I'm just going to talk a bit about flow, and I'm going to say the word flow probably about 100,000 times. But for me, it's a really interesting concept and one that anyone who's exploring interactive media can apply. And I think it's just a really great concept to be familiar with as a game designer. I'm going to talk a bit about me, a bit about games and games in New Zealand, and a little bit more about games. And then I'll go into a few more specific details around flow and how I think it can be applied, just some tips and tricks, depending on if you're making games for education, whether you're making games to create simulation experiences. And that's a fascinating world that I've learned about, the niche of the games industry of simulation games and even just games for education. It's growing every year. And I'm loving learning more and more about it from each and every one of you with the projects that you're doing. And then I'll give a few references. And one area that I do really want to highlight is the Q&A at the end. I hope I can give you an overview of my experience and where I'm coming from in the industry. And I would love for any of you to ask me questions that might be problems that you're facing in your journey or in your projects, and I might be able to give my perspective from how games are built in the traditional games industry, and that's something I'd really love to hear, is just that direct problem and me proposing a solution from where I come from. So just very quickly around flow, the concept of flow, which some of you might be aware of, some of you might know of it but don't really apply it in your games, and some of you might know it very well and have very strong opinions about it. I've done a lot of research into it, and it can be a controversial topic, and I think from my perspective, which I'll talk about in a sec, I'm not an academic. And I think that's a really important point to make. My education journey, is pretty I didn't go to university. I actually studied to be in the film industry after high school, and then I pivoted to games because of my passion for storytelling and just creative tech, and that led me to game development. And I think my journey of academia is very different to everyone in this room, and I have so much respect for for people that have applied their knowledge and thoughts to studying for years on the problems that you're trying to solve. And so I just want to really make that clear that I'm coming from a very probably surface level approach when it comes to academia, and hopefully there's some points that I make that can connect with you and what you're doing. So a little bit about me. I am a games producer by trade. I just, as Haida mentioned, I took on a role as a senior producer at Cerebral Fix. Cerebral Fix is New Zealand's largest outsourcing game studio, and they have clients like Disney, Warner Brothers, EA, and just help with the whole development pipeline across multiple platforms. And so game production is my bread and butter. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis. I also love the games industry in New Zealand, and as chair of the New Zealand Game Developers Association, I've talked to many indie studios looking for funding, talking to studios that want to submit talks to our conference. I've judged on local competitions, local startup competitions. So I have a really strong passion of just helping people that want to make games, make them as successful as possible and make them succeed as much as possible. I'm a gamer, so that's really what led me to pursuing games, is my passion for playing games as a kid. Really just loved getting immersed in all these worlds, and it's been a part of my life since I was a child, and that's, I think, stuck with me, and it's become part of my identity. And I'm so grateful that I was able to find a career in it as well. That's me wearing the Magic Leap device that I helped test at Weta Workshop when we made Dr. Grodbort's. It was a couple of years ago now, and that was a great experimental project. I also am a father. I'm a father of 2 twin girls, and that, I think, plays a really big role in my perspective of games as a medium, what the future of games looks like, how I want my girls to grow up and interact with games when it comes to education and things like that. So that's been a really big part of my journey over the last few years. They're almost 2, and I'm still every week just learning more about them, learning more about what learning is, and how I think games can be incorporated in their journey. So a bit about my career. Like I said, started at Cerebral Fix recently. My past includes some other of New Zealand's biggest game studios, such as Rocketworks, Futureverse, Gameloft when they had a studio in Auckland. They don't anymore, unfortunately, and Weta Workshop. And I've also got some ties to creative organizations like We Create. I've been on the board of the NZGDA for 4 years now, and serving my first term as chair. And I also ran a game development podcast for a year, where every week I interviewed a different game developer from around the world. And all of those episodes are on YouTube if you're interested in hearing from artists, programmers, solo developers, I just really picked anyone that I could find online that was interested to talk, and just spoke to them for an hour. And through that journey, I learned a lot about games and the game development process. I would love to really start that again, but I don't think I have much time these days. These are some of the games that I've worked on in the last 10 years of my career, which crosses mobile games, PC, Steam titles, augmented reality titles, and in the last few years before joining Cerebral Fix, I was at a company that was exploring blockchain technology and how that can change the game experience and the player journey, which has been really fascinating. And I'm really proud that all of these games have been developed in New Zealand, and there's so much more which I'll touch on in a sec. One thing I want to mention about my brain, as I said, I'm not an academic, and I'd say that I'm right-brained, which is the more creative side, whereas the left brain would be defined as the logical, analytical side. And I'd say academics probably tend to be more left-brained people, as opposed to how I see myself, which is more creative, you know, flowy. I'm not really rooted in facts and logic, I guess, and things like that. And that kind of is what you'll feel through the talk when I talk about flow. So just keep that in mind as well. I have so much respect for left-brain people, and in the game development process, you need both to be chiming into any product. So just wanted to touch on that because I thought that was a really interesting part to identify, just what kind of different perspectives there are out there. So a bit about games, because I love the games industry and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to talk about just the medium itself, because I would love everyone to walk away from this feeling even more sure that games are the right medium to be building in right now, and just interactive media in general. So it's continuing to grow year on year. These are the latest stats from Newzoo that the industry is worth 184 billion, which is absolutely massive, and it's still growing year on year. I haven't put any sources on these, but if you're wanting the slides or anything like that, you're welcome to just message me, or I'll let Haida know where she can stick the slides if you want to get this data. I've got a lot of graphics here that I've just collected over the last couple of years that I just wanted to share for people that might not be plugged into the kind of traditional games industry growth. I think these are such fascinating graphs to show the history of games. This is game revenue visualized, and obviously in the traditional games industry, revenue is a big part of it. I doubt revenue is a big part for a lot of your projects and your journeys, but it is a big part of the industry, and I think it's interesting to see how platforms have evolved over time. And this is a fascinating graph that just shows the evolution and where we are now. And hopefully in the next few years, decade, we'll start to see more impact from the education industry, and seeing that really fleshed out in more detail, so that people that are coming into the industry have more examples of what games that are focused on education, that don't have a revenue focus, how they're succeeding and what they're doing right. This is just another stat that gets thrown around a lot when talking about the industry, is how it's bigger than games. Games are bigger than music and film combined, and it just speaks to the power of interactive media, and just the fact that interactive media is being applied to so many different industries as well. I think it's definitely a healthy place to be investing time into, because the roof is not clear yet. And as more and more people are identifying as gamers, as more and more people are being comfortable with technology, the power of games is just getting stronger and stronger as a medium. This is a survey that the NZGDA put out at the end of last year. We're in the middle of doing our 2024 survey at the moment, that should hopefully be released in the next couple months. And just some high-level stats: the industry earned 430 million in revenue last year, which has been, over the last 5 years, a 25% growth. And this is something that at the NZGDA we're advocating to the government, a lot around getting as much support as we can. And we actually received a government sector rebate last year of 20% for anyone making games in New Zealand, which is really helping New Zealanders compete with the likes of Australia, who are offering or are able to offer larger salaries and have some really great government support schemes as well. So that's just another fact, is that our government is showing support for our industry as well, and that's really exciting. And then there's other associations such as Code, based in Dunedin. They went national last year as well, which opens up a flood of opportunities for studios and teams across New Zealand to get access to early stage funding. And they also fund games for education, games that might not be revenue driven but have a really important purpose. They are definitely open to hearing and supporting any of those studios. So we have studios all across New Zealand, and right now, as support's kind of has gone national, we're looking to see in the next few years a real rise across all cities of studios being incorporated. These are just a few of the games that I picked to showcase that have been made or that are being released this year in New Zealand. A lot of people, when I talk about this, don't realize that some of these games that they've heard of overseas were made here. Dredge is a great example that was such an incredible indie success story from last year, which is still being nominated for awards this year, and that was made by a team of 4 here in Christchurch called Black Salt Games. And every year there's some amazing success stories that we're really proud of, and it's great to feel that New Zealand has the right ingredients to be able to compete globally. So I'm really trying to sell New Zealand as a place to make games in, but hopefully you can feel that way with the community as well, because the community is really my favorite part, and this is just the output of some of the hard work and ideas that people have had. There's also a games made in New Zealand playlist on Steam. If you want to see, I think there's maybe 100 games that are listed there. Every year around NZGDC, we have a Steam sale that provides discounts to games made in New Zealand that are available on Steam. So definitely check that out if you are really interested in just finding what other games might be made that you may have heard of, or if you just want to support or play other indie games that are out there, definitely check that out. I think this was interesting. It's just all the different genres that are currently being developed in the traditional space. And the reason I wanted to put the slide in, because I liked that they included educational as one of the genres. And what I would love to see, and what I hope to see in the next decade, is this education category really having its own spiderweb of genres and subgenres, so that we can really understand what the power of education and games can be. So obviously the bulk of this is traditional industries and traditional genres, but yeah, the educational space is definitely growing. I know of tons of active projects around New Zealand right now from really passionate teams, and I'm sure that's the same all over the world. So that's really exciting to see. Now, when I was preparing for this keynote, I really dug deep to try and define for myself what a game is, and I thought it was a really interesting exercise, and I just wanted to share my kind of outcome of that. There probably are holes in this analogy, but it could be really helpful for describing what we do in a very simple way, depending on who we're talking to. So when I think about games, I've split into 4 categories. Games for entertainment, which is to engage people to play an experience. Games for art, which is really the main purpose is to evoke an emotion or evoke a story. Obviously, entertainment and art are kind of intertwined, but it really depends on that core pillar that you're trying to achieve with your game. And then games for education, where you have like a lesson or an outcome that you hope to provide to the player. And then games for simulation, which, if I'm being honest, is quite a new category that I'm trying to wrap my head around. But what I think I've learned from it is that you're trying to bring people together to provide a scenario that you can have meaningful discussion around what some potential solutions are to the problems that you're creating. And so I obviously come from the background of entertainment and games that have revenue-focused business models and have large teams. But I feel like the audience that I'm speaking to today is definitely focused around education and simulation related games. And so I might be wrong in that, and there might be ways that crosses over, but just another point to try and explain where I'm coming from with my ideas here. So in terms of game production, that's what I do on a day-to-day. This chart here just shows a lot of the stages of a game, and I did think a lot about if I wanted to go very deep into how a game is made, because a lot of the people in the audience here might not have that traditional game production background or knowledge. So I thought throwing up a slide like this would be really valuable, just for some of you to have some knowledge, like information to dig deeper on if you did want to try align yourself more to how a traditional game might be made. But one area I wanted to focus on, which I'll be talking about for the rest of this keynote, is this prototyping phase. And for a game studio that's making a game, this prototyping phase is the most critical part of a game. There is a game design document step there, but there's so many decisions around making a game that you can't make just by writing it down on paper. It requires prototyping and testing and iterating. And that is really at the core of what makes games fun and what makes them successful, what makes them memorable, is what happens during this prototyping phase. And the word that has helped describe what happens during this phase and what developers and designers are trying to achieve is trying to get to what this word is, flow. So during that prototyping phase, it's really, you're trying to find that point, and I'm going to go through and just define what it is now. So just a little bit of history. Flow was discovered by a psychologist named Csikszentmihalyi in the early 1970s. He discovered that everyone had the same experience at the height of enjoyment and concluded that happiness is an internal state of being, not an external one. And he called this flow. And a lot of you may have heard this. I've talked to a few other academics, and I think this falls under the positive psychology category. And it might not be rooted in a lot of, I guess, facts and logic, but there is something special here, and there is something that a lot of game designers take from this concept when they apply their thoughts to designing a game. So just a quote here from Mihai. He says, "The ego falls away, time flies, every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one. Like playing jazz, your whole being is involved, and you're using your skills to the utmost." So that's really the point that game designers want to put their players in, is this in this state where they are fully focused, fully immersed. And I think anyone making any type of interactive experience, if you're trying to get to that point where your players are kind of lost in the moment, that's the best way to get results that you want, whether it's finishing the game, whether it's getting to meaningful discussion, whether it's them learning the lesson that you're trying to teach. I think flow is such a critical part to make those games interesting and to get the desired outcome. So it's very easy to find knowledge on flow online, and I think it applies to many industries and just applies to life in general. I think the concept of flow, where based on the difficulty, if it's too hard, you're going to feel anxious. If it's too easy, you're going to get bored. And as you develop the skills required, there is this path of flow that you're trying to retain in order to stay immersed in the experience. And with every game, there are moments, with every successful game that people love to share, they have moments where it gets too hard, but then people persevere. They have to think strategically about how to overcome this level or overcome this boss, and they use that. When they're in the state of flow, that's when they're solving the problem and getting through it. And you're really just trying to make sure that you're taking care of the player throughout that whole journey, and keeping flow in mind the whole way. So I guess at its core, flow is the secret to retaining focus for an experience. And I believe if anyone here is making a game, if you can specifically point to what actions your players are taking that put them in the state of flow, I think that that's a really clever, it shows that game design thought has been put into that experience, and it's not just you're not just kind of reading a textbook or reading rules as a player. You're actually immersed in the experience, and that's where the exciting stuff happens, in my opinion. Just a note, the idea of flow applies to experiences for retaining focus, but the reason why game designers, I think, latch onto the idea of flow is because games are, in its core, just a digital or interactive way of interacting with life. And so the idea of flow transfers very easily from the real world to games as a medium, because of the nature of games being action-based and modeling real life in a lot of ways. And I'll talk about it a bit later, but the role of a game designer and the role of a serious game developer is all about abstracting the world to focus on the rules or the environment that you want to create. And it really is just slicing life in a unique way so that you can be conscious of what flow is being created for that experience. So in terms of practically, how do you get into flow? This is easy to find. You can, there's like, lists and lists of definitions of what flow is and how to get into it. And what I love about it, which is probably also what's really frustrating to a more academic person, is that it is very subjective, and there isn't a formula for how every single experience can be solved. I think it's very unique to what you're trying to build, what the rules of the game are that you're making. So it's, at the same time, there's no easy way to get into flow. But I think if you go into it with these kind of pillars, then you're heading in the right direction. So first off, it's just having clearly defined goals, and for the player to know what they are trying to achieve, and knowing that they want to achieve that as well is really important. The other is clear feedback. So when they're straying off that path of that goal, is it intentional? Are you wanting them to do that? Do they have enough constraints in that experience to feel like they're still going towards that goal and that they're not getting distracted or coming up with new goals that you might not be aware of? And the role of a game designer is really to just understand every step that the player is taking and how that is contributing to the overall experience. And the more you have a grasp on that, the more you will be able to recreate that feeling for every player that plays your game. So clear feedback and that feedback loop is a really important part of a good game design that creates flow. And then also the right challenge. So you don't want a challenge that's too hard. You don't want a challenge that's too easy. There needs to be a clear tutorial state with every game, or every game has to be introduced to a player when it comes to the rules, the constraints, the story, all of that. And how you tell that is just as important as what happens after, is the setup to it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as well later. So how do you change the flow? So if your player is in the state of flow, playing your experience, and they're completely immersed in what the goal is, the things that change, just time naturally, just them playing the game for a period of time can change the state of flow. But increasing the difficulty runs the risk of providing that necessary step that keeps them in the state of flow, or it runs the risk of making it too difficult. And that's a really important part to understand. And the word difficulty as well can be interpreted in different ways. It all depends on who the target audience is, what they're trying to get from the experience. So I'm really trying to cover a wide, high-level description of this that could be applied to any game that's being made. So I apologize for the kind of vagueness, but I think all these principles are really important and can be broken down for every project. Moving the goal. So if a player achieves a goal, they need to have another goal, or there's probably a large goal in the experience, and then there could be micro goals that the player is trying to achieve while holding that bigger goal in the back of their head. And this ties into storytelling as well. When it comes, we are storytelling creatures as humans, and we love to communicate and grow through story, and the goal is directly tied to what the story is. And it depends what kind of game you're making, whether it's rooted in a real life scenario or if it's rooted in something that's imaginary. That goal or that inciting incident for the character in the game that they're trying to achieve is really important to be conscious of. And changing that goal or making it unclear has the risk of making you lose flow. And then adding new required skills. So any kind of game that you might play that is longer than an hour long, you'll probably develop some core game mechanic skills. And throughout that experience, the mechanics may become more complicated so that you can achieve more complicated puzzles or defeat more complicated bosses with these new acquired skills that you've that you've made, and not giving the player new skills or new information to use, or new tools to use to solve the problem, they can lose track of flow. And that also goes the other way around, where if you throw too many skills required at the very beginning of the experience, it might be really hard for the average player to get stuck and immersed in that experience if it's too complicated or the learning curve is too steep too fast. And that's why the tutorial is such an important part of any game experience. So in traditional game development, you want to get the core game loop as quickly as possible and then playtest. So this is what I was talking about before around the prototyping phase. Playtesting it depends what the studio culture is like and how the studio views the projects that they're making. But me personally, I'm a huge believer of playtesting, which is when you just hand a device or hand a controller to someone. There could be some some factors that determine what kind of playtest you get. It could be age related, it could be if they've played a certain game before, but having them play your experience and then just observing them is, for me, the fastest way or the best way to know how to iterate on your experience. And once you have that core game loop of what you think is the most important part of your game that the user will be repeating over and over again to keep them in that state of flow, I think playtesting is the best way to confirm those assumptions. And the sooner you can get to that playtesting phase in any game production journey, the better, because that can lead to you pivoting your game in an entirely different direction. And the less time you waste, I guess, getting to that point, the easier it is to pivot. Because once you've done all of your art, or you've done all your environment work, or you've really run out of time, you might realize that you might find a better way of creating your game, and you might not have time to pivot. So just a bit more detail on playtesting, because I think it's so important. It means putting the game in front of other people, letting them play and asking them what they think. Do they get bored? Are they confused? Is it too easy, too hard? And your answers will surface very quickly and very clearly as a player describing the experience to you. And what I find interesting is game developers, some game designers are really good at playing the game for the first time or playing the game again and acting like it's their first time. But I think at the end of the day, it's impossible to have that initial experience. And as anyone who's played an experience before, the moment they play it again, they already know what to expect. They know where to click and that kind of thing. So having people that have never played your experience before is such a valuable time to document and to ask questions when someone plays your experience for the first time. So that's when you iterate and you try it again, you iterate, and you keep chipping away until that that clear, fun experience of putting players into the state of flow is made really clear, and it keeps them engaged through the whole experience. And you might highlight just a small little section of the game. You might want to give them the device from their very first playtest, and going through the tutorial phase. Or you can focus on certain features and just get their initial thoughts on how they felt that went. So playtesting can take many forms, and that's a whole art in itself, I feel, is how playtests are conducted. Even just standing and hovering over someone as they're playtesting could affect the results, but I think that's a really important part of game development. FTUE, or FTUE, is the first time user experience, and the reason I write that there is that it's mentioned everywhere. All game development talks that focus on the first time user experience, you can find on YouTube. You can find GDC talks that talk about this, and I'm not a game designer by trade, so I would encourage you to look into how other game designers would suggest making the first time experience, or talking about their project and how they tweaked it to make the first time user experience as strong as it could. And that's really important, because that's kind of the on-ramp to get to the state of flow. And it starts all the way back as to what genre game you're making. And if you're making an adventure game, there's some preconceived ideas of what an adventure game is, and whatever the market of an adventure game is at that time. It's all changing and evolving. What devices you use, how the players are playing on those devices or those platforms. That's all really important stuff to know, and you can get some of those nuggets of wisdom from playtesting, or just observing the market and having an assumption as to why you think this first-time user experience is the best way to onboard people into Flow. And then, yeah, once you've onboarded them and they're in that state of flow, that's when you start to add the challenges and the complexities to the game, as they have already understood the rules and know kind of what to do. They can take more information and apply that to what they're doing in a very kind of seamless way. So going into a bit more of a focus on educational experiences, Flow turns games into intrinsically rewarding experiences. And I think that that's really important to note, because when someone's having fun, it's because they've found an internal motivation to continue playing, and it's not because they're seeking the trophies, rewards, or results that are at the other end. And I feel like Flow perfectly describes what that internal motivation is for people to continue wanting to play your experience. And in my opinion, and I like that this is just written and I can look back on this in 10 years, but in my opinion, I feel like the future of education is classrooms that are designed around Flow. And I feel like when it comes to educating children, I think games are clearly a medium that that kids are really attracted to, and I think it's because game designers know how to trigger that flow state. And if educators are able to trigger the flow state as well as traditional game designers now, I think the future of education is going to be very interesting, because games will be tied to being fun as well as providing an end goal. And I think it's interesting that kids will only tell you that they don't like school because it's too hard or because it's boring, which in my mind is a definition that they're not designed for flow. And if you make learning more fun and you find the flow, that kids will learn more. And that's a statement that I would love to see proven in the world over the next decade. I don't know if I'll actively be making educational games, but I'll definitely be playing them, and I'll definitely be curious to know how my kids will experience them as they grow up. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting seeing this comment that you'll never see a game advertised as being easy, because it goes against the concept of flow. And I think the whole purpose of games being a challenge is what is so inviting and interesting and I guess addicting about games, is that when you have that right level of challenge, it keeps people immersed and coming back. And if a game is too easy, then the motivation and the kind of intrigue gets lost. I thought this was really interesting, and at one point the talk focused a lot on AI because it's a big talking point at the moment. But I thought just one slide to put on the conversation is how when you train a human, you require motivation, challenge, storytelling, and a sense of progression to educate them on something. But for a machine learning model, you set the motivations and desired outcome, you run a massive amount of iterations, and then you pick the top result. And I think there's a really interesting discussion now that AI is taking over so much of our day-to-day and us not knowing how much it's going to impact our future. I think it's very clear that humans are a very inefficient machine to teach, because play is the brain's favorite way of learning, in my opinion. So I feel like we can't battle AI in that sense with how we want to train humans versus how AI is able to be trained at a completely different rate than how humans are, and that the experiences that are made to teach humans have to be really made with play and fun and flow at the forefront, because otherwise and obviously we solve different problems than what AI and what computers can, And that is also probably another point, is the game that you're making something that is more needing to be targeted to a computer to learn to do rather than targeted to other humans. And I think we're going to find a lot of these headlines in the next few years around problems that people have created machine learning models to solve that have provided humans with the necessary ideas and solutions to solve them rather than them coming from humans first. Anyway, this is very much like a whole different chapter that I'm not educated enough to talk about, but I thought it was a really interesting topic to at least touch on, around how play is really important for humans to learn. Yet a machine doesn't need play or need flow in order for them to make a meaningful jump in learning. Talking a little bit about simulation games, I think if you talk to the average person out on the street, they might think that focus and being focused, and this kind of talks about education as well, that focus is about raw willpower. But what I think is really interesting is that game designers, they win our focus by creating context that draws our brains into flow. And so it kind of flips it a bit, where you might have a lesson that needs to be taught, and you might think that if everyone put the same amount of willpower into that lesson or into that problem, that everyone will solve it eventually. But I think if you change the way that lesson is told to the player, and if you onboard them right, if you get them into the state of flow and you carry them on through that journey, then they can reach the lesson of that problem potentially faster. They would have more fun doing it. They might come up with better solutions than just putting yourself into the problem with no game design kind of hand holding along the way. And I thought that was really interesting, and I think that's one of the reasons why I believe so much in the kind of simulation games industry and the niche of games, because it's taking the benefits of interactive media and applying them to some really big problems, and turning it into a game, turning it into fun and into play, I think is such a fascinating way to find the solutions that are out there for some really big problems. I thought I'd touch on this as well, which is another topic that has come up in a lot of different areas. Mark Rober, who's a scientist, came up with a concept called the Super Mario effect, and he's got a great TED talk on it, which I'd encourage going to listen to, because he communicates it so eloquently, far better than